Welcome to the Prime Property Finance Podcast with Gareth Morgan and Mark Watts. This unique podcast will dive deep into all areas of property investing finance, going behind the scenes with property professionals, investors and clients. Between us, we have 35 plus years experience in property finance. The podcast has been launched to share knowledge, mindset requirements and experiences of successful investors and professionals. We aim to simplify many of the complicated areas of finance and investing and provide valuable and easy to implement tips. Keep an eye out for our new longer episodes every Tuesday and our shorter ones every Friday. Welcome to the latest episode of the Prime Property Finance Podcast with myself, Gareth Morgan, and Carol Clarke of Bramall Town Planning. Carol's an experienced town planner and a property investor herself. And I'm really excited to bring you this episode. She is going to give us a bit of a market update as to what's going on currently and the things to watch out for and the experiences that she's had been on how to submit good applications, where the opportunities lie for investors going into 2026. And we have a bit of a deep dive into HMOs and commercial conversions. So yeah, great episode. Please listen all the way. And let's dive into it. Carol, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Really excited to have you here. Really excited to bring your experience to the show to share with our listeners. So do you want to just give us a bit of a background about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. So Carol Clarke, I am a chartered town planner, but I very specifically act for landowners and developers and help them increase the value of their land and property using the planning system. So I've done this both in big corporate consultancies, I've worked for landowners, I've worked for developers, and for the last 8 years, I've done this through my own company, Bramall Town Planning.
Amazing. Thank you, Carol. And is that local to you that you help people with, or is that UK-wide? What's your kind of scope and reach?
Historically, it has generally been across the northwest of England, but more and more requests across the rest of England. Occasionally, I've gone into North Wales and Anglesey. A lot of it is about if I have to go and do a site visit or if I have to go to planning committee. But at the moment, I've got sites down in Somerset, Norfolk Park, in Brent, in London, in Basildon, in Boston, in Lincoln. Just submitted an application in York. So yeah, it's very much client led.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the way of the world now, isn't it? It's a lot easier to do, to have a bigger reach. How are the differences between local authorities? Well, I suppose we'll probably dive into this a little bit later on, but is there a huge difference between local authorities in terms of planning?
I mean, in England, all local authorities work to the English planning legislation and then the English National Planning Policy Framework. And then every local authority, every council has their own development plan, which, is like a 200, 300 page document that sets out all their policies and aspirations for the next 10 years, 15 years of development. And it has an accompanying proposals map with it. So in terms of, I think, major housing developments, it does depend on whether the council can meet their 5-year housing land supply or not, as to how receptive they are to residential schemes. But generally, I do find they're all very busy. And generally, I do find there is just constant delays, unfortunately. So, yeah, you have to be prepared to be in it for the long term.
Long term. Planning is definitely a long-term game, right?
Yes.
So in terms of, where we're at the moment, just the wider economy and the landscape, the property market and the planning space has changed massively over the last couple of years, as you're aware. What is the general feeling in the environment at the moment when it comes to planning?
So, I mean, at the moment, so I generally work with small and medium landowners and developers, and, around 35 applications on at any time, from one house to an apartment block for 106 apartments. And in general, there is an appetite for development and there is an appetite to see schemes come forward, but we do have lots of hoops to jump through. And that can be design, highways, ecology, flood risk. And that is often what takes the time on planning applications, assessing all the technical matters. So that is generally the frustration that I find from my developers, the time it takes for an application, and indeed the costs to prepare planning applications.
Huge, isn't
Each
it?
of the technical reports can be a few £1,000s each. And of course, it's all at risk as well.
So of the investors and developers that you're working with, what would you say as a proportion are doing this as a planning gain paper exercise to either take some land that they've got through or some they've acquired, take it through the planning process and flip for a profit, compared to developers who are actually actively looking for sites who want to then develop them out themselves?
Do you know, it does change. A lot of the times my developers will start the process with the intention of delivering the development, but because the planning application has perhaps taken a lot longer, then a lot more are flipping sites on, because during that time they might have bought another site and they're getting on and delivering that site instead, and so they've reallocated funds. So I guess it could be 30-40% instead of actually delivering. 30 to 40% are flipping on now.
Yeah. No, it's interesting just to see the dynamic. And I know some locally with us, a lot of developers that I'm speaking to, or land agents and things, they're banking, land banking, as opposed to developing, purely because of the cost of the developments. So they've got the planning, but they're sitting on them a little bit because the cost to develop and maybe the demand in the market for the new units isn't quite there. So it's interesting just to get a different perspective on it.
And I mean, the government's target of 1.5 million homes is also an interesting one, because quite often I know I've got planning permission on a site and I might drive past it and it's not been delivered. And it could have been 3, 4, 5 years ago. And I was reading on the construction index that actually said 40% of planning permissions never get implemented. Now, obviously, land costs, actual construction costs are a big factor, but there could be so many others, that including Section 106 costs or SIL costs, community infrastructure levy, that weren't initially factored into viability appraisals. So I think it's interesting, the government's 1.5 million target, because if 40% that get approved as per the construction index, actually, what's that? We actually need to be approving 2.1 million homes. So in actual fact, the target is much higher. So we need to be approving more in order to get to that 1.5 million.
Yeah, wow. And we're not even anywhere near that either, are we? So I know the government, when they came in, said that they were going to build, and they were going to make it easier to get planning permission and straighten up the process. My understanding is, and I don't have the exact figures or facts, but my understanding is that planning approvals have actually reduced since they've come in. What's your stance on that? Are you finding that the local authorities are more supportive or not towards conversions and development? And is there much political pressure? Has there been any loosening to the system so far?
So, I mean, every planning application has to be determined on its own merits. And when we talk about its own merits, we look at, ultimately the layout and design. We look at what impacts, what compliance with the policies in the development plan does the scheme has. Does it comply with highways requirements, car parking requirements? Can it provide the garden standards or open space requirements? So every scheme is different. In general, what I have noticed is in the last 12 months, I've submitted 3 planning appeals, and I haven't done a planning appeal for 5 years because I've been getting everything through. And so that is, from my own business perspective, it's been very interesting. And each of those, 2 of them were refused on design grounds, and 1 was a highways matter. Now, design is always difficult, and that's where I find a lot of contention, because what I consider a good design or what you consider a good design will be completely different. And so the design assessment from a planning officer or from neighbours, it can be so subjective. But similarly, it's very difficult unless the policy says no more than 2 stories and you're promoting a 3-story development, then that's quantifiable. But otherwise, design is very, very difficult because it's so subjective. And so I find, unfortunately, design, if they want to refuse it, then design is generally the reason that they will go down, because I'm afraid it is subjective.
One of the last refusals we had was based on design. So it's funny you mentioned that.
Right.
And that was because, and the crazy thing about this was we applied for a pair of semis in a garden, and we modelled it on a pair of semis probably 50 meters up the road, which was a relatively new build. We thought, well, let's just copy those because they've had approval, and they declined it on design because the property was had been brought into a conservation area at a later date, and so they wanted some sort of barn, a 1.5 story type barn style property, which is what they wanted. So then, yeah, that was a frustrating one.
It is frustrating, yeah.
Yeah, what I'm seeing, every time I speak to a developer or a planner or anything like that, all I hear about is the additional requirements that you need from a planning perspective. You've always had highways and ecology with bat surveys and things like that, but it seems to be more and more of these reports needed now. You just reeled off a few of them. All I ever, I think about is the cost then of bringing in, a specialist to help with that report and the time that it takes to get all of these things through. And they never seem to take away requirements, which makes it easier. So I guess at some point they're going to have so many different requirements. Like you said, the cost of actually just putting in the planning application itself becomes ridiculous. And it just seems so difficult to make it anything commercially viable.
Yes. And I mean, there's 2 potential opportunities that developers can look at. If your scheme is 9 houses or less, then it's what's classed a minor application, or if it's 100,000 square meters. And so a council has a planning application validation list, and it will say, these are the documents we require for a minor planning application, and these are the documents we require for a major, so 10 houses or more. And so one way to look at it could be constrain yourself to minor applications, because there's a lot less documents because they are minor. So there are less considerations. There are still statutory requirements, for example, like a design and access statement or the biodiversity net gain assessment. So that's one way developers could look at sites. For example, if you've got a site and you were thinking, I'll put 10 houses on there. Well, actually, does it stack up on 9? Because also a minor application target determination is 8 weeks, whereas a major application target determination is 13 weeks. So there's a time difference as well. Quite often as well, minor applications can be excluded from planning committee unless they get certain number of objections and trigger other matters, whereas a major application is more likely to go to planning committee. The other way that you can try and lessen your risk is a really unused route, and it's called a permission in principle, which is a PIP. Now, quite often people will say to me at the start of a site assessment, Carol, shall we do pre-app? And I do recommend doing pre-app in most instances, but if you do pre-app, you have to be aware that you just get an opinion of an officer. And even if you get a positive pre-app, it does not mean that you will get planning permission. So in actual fact, I have and do recommend in some instances that instead of doing pre-app, you actually do what's called a permission in principle. And that is literally an edge red plan. an indicative layout. So the most recent one I did was a reasonable site, had one massive bungalow on it. And a PIP, you can apply for planning permission for up to 9 houses. So we wanted to demolish the bungalow and build 3 bungalows. And we just have a master plan to show how those 3 bungalows could be laid out, and they could have gardens and they could have parking. But we don't ask for that plan to be approved. And we just submit a planning statement that sets out that the location, the site is sustainable, and that the site can accommodate it. Now, that example itself, I had trees that had TPOs on them. I didn't have to submit a tree survey. I didn't have to submit any ecology surveys or bat surveys, because this is the purpose. The government brought in the permission in principle in 2017, 2018 to help small and medium developers, because they were saying we're spending all thousands and thousands at risk without any assurance, because pre-app is still not giving you the assurance. And in actual fact, you actually get a permission. It is a planning permission. Now, you can't build from that. And I'm sure, Gareth, you're going to tell me lenders are not going to lend on that because there is still risks and uncertainty. So, but what I've actually seen is in auctions, people have bought sites, submitted and got a permission in principle, and then put the sites straight back into the auction. And they are selling the site with planning permission, because it is a planning permission, but it's only a permission that says the principle of 3 houses on this site is acceptable. It's a 2-phase process. So then you have to submit a technical details consent, a TDC. And at that point, then you have to get your tree survey done, your ecology surveys done. But at least you can go to your lenders and say, look, we've got the permission in principle, we've got the principle established. There is still risks with a technical details consent, but that's another way that developers can try and lessen the risk and lessen the upfront costs to get that in principle approval.
Is that then maybe replacing outline planning?
No, it doesn't replace outline.
No, outline planning is still a separate form of planning, right?
And even with an outline planning application, the main difference between an outline and a full application is you still have to get all your technical reports done. It's just you don't need your full set of drawings because you're not asking for the design to be approved. So this is why the permission in principle route is a helpful route, particularly on the cost and lessening the risk and that initial outlay, getting all those technical reports done.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I'd not heard of that before, so that's really valuable. Thank you.
It can be very helpful, particularly on ecology. So, for example, at this time of year, I'm having to advise lots of people, we can't submit your planning application because we're not in the bat survey season and things like that. Whereas this way, you can still seek your permission in principle, and that might take. And actually, the target determination for a PIP is only 5 weeks. And I am seeing they are going through far quicker, not always in 5 weeks, because you haven't submitted all these technical reports. And that therefore means the council planning officer does not need to consult highways or the ecologist. And that's what takes the time in planning applications. So quite often it's also a good way, if you do need to do ecology surveys, to submit your PIP during this period so you're not losing time. Perhaps you've got a site on a 12-month option, for example. So you're not losing time. And then when you get it through, and you might be coming into the survey season, then you can submit your technical details consent with the relevant ecology surveys.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, I think my bugbear's always been, it's just, sometimes you just need to pick up the phone and speak to someone and say, look, is this, and it's just so hard to get hold of anybody that just to have a conversation. They all know you have to put in a pre-application. I'm like, well, then you just, it's just a barrier, isn't it? And I get, they're understaffed and it's difficult, and they do, they don't want to be speaking to phone calls all the time. But if you've got a genuine case, I guess they just probably been inundated with people just trying to have those phone calls, right? But yeah, it'd be good to have something which is a little bit somewhere in between even this permission in principle or a pre-app, some sort of service in between where it's a light touch, just to kind of, even if it's a phone call or a Teams meeting that you can pay for half an hour or something, just to kind of have a chat about a particular site that you're interested in. I think that would help smoothen up, and because now people will be submitting things, clogging up the system, which potentially are never going to go anywhere for that reason.
It is difficult, yeah. There are still some authorities do operate a telephone service 9 a.m. till 12 where you can phone up, but it's very general and you get very general answers, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. That's really interesting. Let's talk about HMOs. So one of the things that we, obviously investors, from an investor perspective, HMOs are a really popular investment strategy. There's, interest in higher cash flow and higher yielding properties. And people who they start off with buy-to-lets, and then they look at, where they can get the best returns. And that's usually via HMOs. And there's also a huge shortage in rental properties available. And so the demand for HMOs becomes higher. What are you seeing in terms of HMOs at the moment? Do you see any issues from a planning perspective? What are the regular kind of queries and issues that you come across?
Yeah, so I would always recommend to somebody that if they are going to spend, let's say, £100,000 converting a property into a HMO, that they do first seek a certificate of proposed lawfulness. And because that will confirm then that the change of use from the C3 dwelling house in England to the C4 HMO use is lawful, and that prevents any future enforcement action. I've been recommending that for years anyway, because permitted development rights change. And so you've always then got that piece of paper, that certificate. And everybody's different, and everybody has different levels of risk averseness. And some people don't want to wait, and they'll say, Carol, if you think it's permitted development, just going to get on and do it. However, in the northwest of England, where I am, we have seen in the last few months at least 3 authorities bring in immediate Article 4s. And for those that are not familiar with the term, Article 4 is an element of planning legislation that removes the permitted development right to allow a change of use from a C3 dwelling house to a C4. And so those people that are in the middle of legals or buying houses specifically to convert to HMOs will now have to submit a planning application. Those people that are mid-conversion from a residential house to a C4 will have to submit a planning application. And we've also seen at least 3 or 4 other authorities bring in Article 4s, but give a 3 to 12 month grace period to be. And the reason that they do that is that it lessens the amount of compensation claims from developers that are mid-build, etc. So we are seeing a lot of removal of permitted development rights from C3 to C4. And it is a shame, and I don't necessarily agree with it. Every local authority does their assessments and has to justify the Article 4 and the removal of the permitted development rights. So it's very much area specific, but there is a need for HMOs. Not everybody wants to buy their own house. Not everybody wants to live alone in their own flat. And a lot of people do like the social aspects of HMOs. And yes, a lot of young professionals perhaps are more transient and want that flexibility. So there's absolutely a need for HMOs, and they form a valued aspect of our housing provision. Local authorities are concerned over the loss of family homes, but of course we can contend that if we were granting more planning permissions to build more homes, of course, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess just for some clarity, if someone was to buy a property now in in England specifically, and they wanted to just go, well, I want to create a HMO out of this. So let's say, for argument's sake, a 4-bed HMO. Under the current rules, depending on where it is, how easy is that, and what would they need to go through? Would they need to go through any planning permission?
So first of all, you'd need to check, does the property have permitted development rights? So, because individual properties can have permitted development rights removed. And generally, I see permitted development rights removed on individual properties if there's been a planning permission on that property before. The council quite often take the opportunity to add a planning condition removing all future permitted development rights. It could be that they extended the property and they don't want any more extensions, but they quite often just do a blanket removal of all future permitted development rights. So that's one thing to check.
And how would they check that?
So the easiest way to check is, so let's say, for example, your property is in Manchester. So you literally go onto good old Google and put Manchester planning application search. It will bring you to the planning application search page, and you just put the address of the property in, and it will bring up all the planning history of that property and if there is any or not. So they generally go back to the 1990s, but it will give you a really good idea. And then separately, you can literally go onto Google, and you could just, again, put into Google Manchester Article 4 removal of HMO permitted development rights, and it will bring up whether Manchester has an Article 4, and indeed it does and has done for a long time. So yeah, absolutely do your due diligence, but also be aware that they can just bring them in as well.
Okay, that's awesome. So the next step then is, I want to purchase a property that is in an Article 4 area, doesn't have a HMO approval, but I would like to apply for a HMO approval. What does that process look like?
So you would have to seek planning permission. And if it's a residential property, it's more than likely the council in their development plan that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion will have a planning policy saying, if you wish to convert your property from a C3 residential to a C4 HMO, or what is called a sui generis HMO. So a C4 HMO is 3 to 6 individuals sharing, and it's 3 to 6 persons, not bedrooms. Then that's a C4 use. 7 plus is considered a sui generis use. In planning, we steal lots of Latin terms, and that is simply a use on its own, loosely translated. So you would have to apply for planning permission. You would have to check the council's policy in their development plans. So, for example, a lot of councils have policies that say, if there are more than 10 existing at 10% within a 100-meter radius of the property, if there are more than 10% existing HMOs, then your application shall be refused. So you need to check your council's policies if you're applying for planning permission.
And is that a completely hard and fast rule then, that, yeah, it's over 10%, or is there any sort of opportunity to still apply and or appeal a refusal?
You need to have reasons. So planning legislation dictates that planning permission shall be forthcoming if a development is in line with the development plan. So we should always try and meet the policies in the development plan. Probably 80% of the planning applications I do not. And that's where a good planning consultant will come in. And we have to come up with reasons called material considerations as to why should that council go against their own planning policies and grant you planning permission. And so I'm afraid I would generally urge people avoiding referring to precedents. Occasionally they can be helpful, but what you actually want to do is focus on your building and identify reasons as to why the local authority should grant planning permission for your change of use to a C4 HMO. on very individual reasons. For example, it could be lots of reasons that we would look at the size of the garden. It might have very good access, highly sustainable outside with a bus stop outside, it might have off-road parking, plenty of room for bins. So we look at, well, what impacts of 6 people occupying that property does it have? But yeah, it comes down to the councils, how restrictive their development plan policies are, though.
You sometimes see now space properties, for instance, which are in a predominantly student area, for instance, just as an example. And maybe there's a family home. So there's basically a row of student houses, and there's a family home where there's an elderly person who's lived there all their life, has now passed away, but it's a 6-bed house, effectively. It's a 3 or 4 story house in amongst a load of student properties, and it's now been left, but it's for all intents and purposes, it's a C3 family home. That no one really, and I'm being generic here as well, there won't be many families that would want to live right in the middle of a row of student houses. Yet now, because that property is in an Article 4 area, by the determination and the policy, that they won't grant any more planning approvals for a HMO. Is that something that would likely potentially be considered as a change of use?
So in that instance, I would not knowing what the policies are, but in that instance, I would strongly suggest that you have an agent market the property. So it's on the market and you gather very specific data as to who is interested in it. So let's say 100 people are interested, 99% of those people are developers. And the one person that is interested, didn't put an offer in, the one other person. Also, you would get a report from your agent as to, well, how many people actually offered, is the price reasonable, or is it being priced out of the market? So it's getting valuation advice that the price is not extortionate, that it's pricing out families, and that's why there's not been any interest. So in that instance, I would suggest gathering that type of market intelligence.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Let's move on then to sort of permitted development, commercial conversions, commercial to resi, that type of thing. That's obviously a massive area. It has been in England. It's a great opportunity for investors and developers. Again, being a little bit biased towards Wales because that's where I live and that's where I invest. It's pretty frustrating because I can see so many opportunities around the place, but without having to go through the planning process just makes it not unviable, but it's a different ballgame, isn't it, compared to being able to put in a permitted development application. So where are the opportunities at the moment? What kind of permitted development requests are you seeing? Where are those opportunities right now?
I see an awful lot of Class E commercial business schemes seeking prior approval to convert to residential. And I would always recommend, where possible, to establish, does a building have permitted development rights? Even if actually you don't want to use those permitted development rights, but in actual fact, quite often we'll use them to trade off against actually what you do want to deliver. And so quite often there's a 2-stage planning strategy. But yes, in England, they are an excellent permitted development route, particularly with commercial buildings. Barns are also another good route as well. The change of use of barns to residential using permitted development rights, or indeed to commercial uses as well. So, yeah, I would always recommend using permitted development rights. It's a much, much quicker route, less onerous, less technical documents, less risk. 56 days, target approval. So yes, it is a good route. And the government has acknowledged that an awful lot of homes are being delivered through the use of permitted development rights. And so it is working to help deliver more homes. But of course, the changes were brought in England to help regenerate a lot of high streets, bring more people into town centres. So you've got more footfall for other retained business uses and shops. And so we have a greater mix of communities. Many, many years ago, we were master planning town centres here, residential here, offices over here. But we realized people are getting in their cars and just driving between them, and that has created the gridlock on the roads. So luckily, the planning system did recognize this, and development plans are seeking more mixed developments now and mixed communities. And the permitted development rights, changes of use from commercial to residential are helping a lot of regeneration in town centres. And I get a lot of requests for advice on permitted development rights. There is, crikey, over 60 different permitted development rights. And it is actually finding the right route through. So some commercial buildings, there can be more than one permitted development right. So sometimes it is about actually finding the best route through for you.
You mentioned Class E there. Can you just explain to listeners what Class E is?
Yes, Class E is the commercial business and services. So that includes things like a retail shop, a cafe, financial and professional. So, for example, a mortgage brokers or an estate agent, beauty salons, hairdressers, offices, and light industrial. A light industrial use that is not noise generating or odor generating and is acceptable with residents as being neighbors. So yeah, and of course you can convert between those uses. So for example, if you're looking at a vacant shop and actually the local pizza parlor want another restaurant, then you could secure them as a tenant, and that's not a change of use. So you don't need to go near the planning system. So you can change between those commercial uses. And again, this is the government trying to make it easier to reoccupy empty and vacant commercial units. Now, one anomaly that a lot of people don't realize is public houses, is pubs. Pubs were excluded from that, and pubs are a sui generis use. And that means that actually those pubs do not have permitted development rights to change to residential. So if it is a pub or a wine bar as a drinking establishment, you would need to apply for planning permission.
Does it still have the permitted development rights to convert it to a supermarket? I know that was a quirk in the system, wasn't it?
Yes, and that's why we see lots of Tesco's and Tesco local stores and Asda's in converted pubs. Yeah, I'm afraid not. There is a quirk whereby there is an aspect of the legislation in pubs that if you are able to demonstrate at a certain point in time, if the pub serves food and serves food across the entire floor area of the pub, and it's not just part of it, there is an opportunity to seek to demonstrate that actually it's not a pub. So this is quite interesting because I see a lot of commercial agents marketing pubs as public houses, when in actual fact, when I look into it, I consider there's an argument to argue it's actually a restaurant. And actually, therefore, it's a Class E, and therefore it does have permitted development rights.
Right, so okay, that's interesting.
But do get planning advice from a planning consultant if you think a pub actually might not be a pub and might actually be a restaurant.
So what about then, as an example, if I came to you, Carol, and said, right, I found this office block, it's been empty for a while, I'm interested in converting this to residential flats or potentially a large HMO or something like that. Is that something that would automatically qualify then for permitted development? And if we've been through the register and it hasn't been removed, and what does that sort of process look like then from an application perspective? Some people may have never heard of permitted development is my point.
So if it is an office, and we know it is an office, so it is a Class E. So first of all, we would check that it still has permitted development rights, so that there's been no previous planning permissions removing those permitted development rights, and that there is not an article for doing a blanket removal. So, and then there are a number of conditions if you want to convert it to residential that you have to meet from, to ensure that the land is not contaminated, it's not in a flood zone, there are no transportation and highways matters preventing its change of use. So we would just go through those steps to check that, and you can go on flood mapping for planning, and it will tell you if your site is in flood zone 1, flood zone 2, flood zone 3. You want your site to be in flood zone 1. And then, the contamination point, quite often if it's been an office building and there's a car park, if you're going to convert it to residential, you could have a garden in the car park, and there could be petrol leakage and contamination. And if those new residents are going to start growing food, then there's a contamination point. So that's why sometimes we might have to submit a contamination report just to confirm there's no risk to human health. But it's a much more straightforward process.
Yeah. And do you ever get those applications? Do they ever get refused?
I've never had one, but yes, they can be. And it is just because you don't meet the conditions. So for example, one of the conditions being you have to meet minimum space standards. So if you're converting a building to 8 flats, 8 one-bedroom flats, then the minimum space standard is 37 square meters for each flat. And if you've submitted drawings that show each flat is only 35, then you don't meet the condition and the criteria. So, yeah.
Would there be any examples where they would allow flats under 35 or 37 square meters?
No, not for permitted development. It's a conditional permitted development.
But you could apply for full planning permission then if there was an argument to say, well, actually, there's a lack of affordable housing and we think we can...
Yes, I have secured them in the past under 37 square meters. But again, it's been about justifying why should this development and only this development, because local authorities, if they deviate from their own policies or national standards, then they are setting a precedent, and they then don't want all other developers coming along saying, well, you granted them permission for theirs. So it's very much about demonstrating why your site is individual. So I've done it on a couple of occasions whereby it's been below the 37 standard, but I had the most beautiful Victorian property with floor to ceiling windows, significant floor to ceiling head heights. The volume made the flats feel significant. We had balconies. I demonstrated that we could obviously accommodate bath shower rooms, as well as living areas, dining areas, kitchen areas, and bedroom areas. So it's about demonstrating the livability of the new residential dwelling. And then another example, I've done it for a provider who is, and we actually secured flats between 18 square meters and 26 square meters.
Yeah. Okay.
But on that basis, though, we secured it under a sui generis use class because it was very specific to that provider. And so they didn't then want the provider selling the building and somebody using it as straight C3. But that planning permission was acceptable for my provider.
Okay, so yeah, that's really helpful, and like I said, I'm a little bit gutted that we don't get more PD rights in Wales. I'm sure there would be a lot of opportunities, and I'm sure there's some English investors waiting in the wings for those changes to come in potentially and swooping up some deals that are available. But maybe your phone be ringing hot when the time comes, if the time comes. So watch this space. So in terms of, from an investor perspective, then, if we just go back then to just generally navigating sort of policy and risk of a planning application, And then the other thing would be in local variations. Do you see many variations? I know you mentioned around PDPs, not PDPs, rather LDPs, the local development plan, and each local authority has their own targets of what they will and won't do based on their targets. But in general, what are the factors that you see and how do you overcome them? One of the big ones is always when we look at flats, blocks of flats is my main focus. And one of the things is always around parking. And then you see some schemes in town centres with 40 flats that have zero parking. And then you're trying to do a block of 6 and they say, no, you need parking. How does that work? And so for me, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. But are there anything, design standards? You mentioned just now about minimum space standards. Obviously, there's a big push on the green agenda with minimum EPC standards, but I'm not sure that's fully found its way into planning yet. But that would be interesting as well to hear your thought on that.
Yeah, I think I would suggest first and foremost, if you're looking at a building or a parcel of land, perhaps it's, a rear garden or side on plot development. First and foremost, can you access the site? If you can't access it, then move on to the next. Every council has their own development plan and their own policies. And so highways and parking are key policies. And yes, they're all different. The key difference is some councils say we want a minimum of 1 parking space per 1-bed flat, a minimum of 2 parking spaces for 2 or 3-bed homes. Some councils say we want a maximum of 1 parking space per 1-bed flat, a maximum of 2 parking spaces per 2 or 3-bedroom flat. Now, if it's a minimum, you have to provide it, and if you're not providing it, then you need to justify through either a parking survey. And I did one recently, and I was walking the streets between 5:30 and 6:30 a.m. and between 7:30 and 6:30 and 7:30 p.m. And in that instance, I was able to justify that there were 84 parking spaces on street. And I only needed to justify 3 parking spaces. So with my parking survey, I was able to justify to the highways officer that this development is not going to impact the local highway or operation or impact the safety of the local highway. And that's what the highways officer is looking at. Now, if your council has a maximum parking standard and says it is a maximum of 1 space per 1-bed apartment, that means you can provide 0 and you're in line with policy. So just a tip there to look at your policy in respect of parking. Another key matter is if you're converting a building, do you need to add extra windows to allow for what we call habitable rooms? So a habitable room is a room where anybody would spend a period of time, a bedroom, a lounge, a dining room, a dining kitchen. Case law has dictated a bathroom is not a habitable room, so you do not have to have a window in a bathroom. And a galley kitchen, inspectors at appeals have determined a galley kitchen is not a habitable room. And because you're in and out, you're not spending time in that environment. So if you need to add extra windows, then a key factor is, well, where are those windows going? What is the outlook? And does the council have separation distances? So is there existing residential opposite, for example? And as a general rule of thumb, if your building is back of pavement looking onto the highway, most local planning authorities seek a 19-meter separation distance. Now, it is arguable if you've already got some windows that 1 or 2 more is immaterial. If it's to the rear, then generally most councils 2-story to 2-story seek 21 meters separation distance. And for every additional story, it's an extra 3 meters. So if you've got a 3-story building, even if it's only 2-story to the rear, then, and if you need to put extra windows in, or you want to put a dormer on, for example, on the rear, then it's about overlooking, and that's the key, one of the key aspects, the impact on amenity of existing residents. Now, if your building is looking onto an industrial estate, then it's not going to have the same issues. So it's the impact on existing residential amenity, but also ensuring that the new residents' amenity is going to be acceptable, that they're not half a meter from a brick wall. They're not looking out straight flat onto a brick wall. So those are, two key general ones.
Yeah, awesome. And then obviously we're talking about now looking at, we're coming towards the end of the year and into 2026. We've got the budget happening. Do you see any, do you have any predictions of any major changes to planning policy that the government will come through? Has there been anything mooted in your professional circles of whispers that things may come through?
Well, we have the Planning and Infrastructure Bill has been making its way through Parliament for a little while. It's already been through the Commons and has now reached the Lords and has had 2 readings in the Lords. So it'll be going through for its 3rd reading. It's a pretty high-level document. It's looking at enhancing the delivery of infrastructure quickly, the delivery of major developments, looking at unlocking land using compulsory purchase powers. It is looking at removing smaller applications from going to planning committee. So that's very much welcome to a lot of small and medium developers that I work with. Otherwise, there's not been anything in terms of changes to permitted development rights. The big change we had last year in England in December 2024 was the government's change to the Green Belt policy, where they introduced the Grey Belt criteria, which has generated, I don't have the exact figures, but I've seen lots of permissions come through as a result of arguing the Grey Belt criteria instead of it just being standard Green Belt, and lots of appeals being approved. So that I have seen, I think, has been the biggest improvement to increasing the housing numbers. But yeah, we're still a long way off. And I think there's been, obviously, we've got the budget coming up. So we may see some other changes once they've got the budget out the way.
Fingers crossed. So in terms of, your role as a planning advisor, what role, does good planning advice play in maximizing return on investment for investors?
I would urge people to approach a planning consultant to get some advice before they buy sites, because quite often, on the face of it, it might not look like there's an opportunity, but it could be that actually there's a 2-stage opportunity. And so I would do a site planning appraisal that would set out the strategy of a planning application to get them to their end objective. It would also set out the likely costs. Do they need to include for Section 106 costs or community infrastructure levy costs in their offer documents and in their viability appraisals? So I would set out and undertake a site planning appraisal if somebody is thinking about considering buying a parcel of land, and that'll set out a planning strategy to get them to their objective, and also what documents would be required, what costs for preparing those documents. Is there any Section 106 requirements, and so the costs associated with those, or community infrastructure levy? So they can include those in their viability documents and their offer price to the owners.
Yeah, I think there's too many landowners, specifically selling land, who are still working off a third methodology. And for those who don't know what that is, it's a third for the cost of the land, a third for the cost of the build, and a third of profit for the developer, and which is very, very outdated by this day and age. So they are always asking, and I've had a number of conversations with people who are trying to sell land, and I said, you need to understand that if you give me this piece of land, I still couldn't make any money. That's the reality in some examples of areas based on the location and the end values and the cost of going through the planning process and developing that site. It just not even viable. And so they've got ideas of grandeur in their heads about what these plots of land. So I know developers, one of the biggest challenges they're having when they're speaking with landowners is the reality of actually what this site is worth. And if you can go back to them with, look, this is a long list of things that we need, and the costs of getting this through approval as a risk factor, then obviously that's going to help, isn't it, with your conversations and your negotiations. Amazing. So just to kind of wrap up then, have you got any if you had to have one golden rule for property investors before they buy or convert a property, what would it be?
Make sure you can access it.
Access, yeah.
Yeah,
that's the key.
Make sure you can access it.
And I, you see people cut off ransom strips, isn't it, where they split titles and there's a big field that you could develop 50 houses, and actually there's a little strip of land at the front end which has been separated on title for this very purpose.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. Yeah. I've seen it time and time again, unfortunately. So due diligence, get your searches, get your legals checked. Can you access it?
Awesome. So thanks very much, Carol. There's been some absolute corkers of tips in there, some things I've never heard of. So I'm sure the listeners will have taken a whole load of value from that. So thank you for your time. We really do appreciate it. If people wanted to learn more about you or get some professional advice, because obviously you clearly know what you're talking about based on the success rate you've had with your planning applications and your permitted development applications. So how can they find you? How can they learn more or get in touch?
Oh my goodness, thank you. So the best way is to go to bramhalltownplanning.com. So that's BRAMHALL, bramhalltownplanning.com. Or indeed, we've had a good discussion about permitted development rights, and I am currently launching askcarol.ai, and that is a very specific permitted development rights app to help small and medium developers assess sites quickly and easily before they buy them, to understand, does it have permitted development rights? And if it does, what are the steps they have to follow? So they can go to askcarol.ai and find out more and join the waiting list for that. But yeah, I would just urge people to embrace the planning system. Don't run scared of it. There are stacks of opportunities. It's just about finding that route through to get you to your objective.
And that's a really good point that you've made there. And I know a planning consultant friend of mine, and he talks about this a lot, is, people have bought the property and they said, have you taken advice before you got the property? Yeah, I asked Google. And I'm sure with the rise of ChatGPT and AI, are you finding that people one, are you using it? And two, are you finding that it's spitting out actually correct information?
Yes, I do use it. Some information is correct, but some information is not. And that's why I created askcarol.ai, because yes, it's an AI powered, it links. You have confidence that it is linked to the correct legislation. And then it's also powered by the wisdom of me as well, and my 20 plus years experience. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, listen, thank you, Carol, for your time. I really do appreciate it. It's been a great conversation, and potentially we'll have you back on in the future if and when things change with the planning system, or if there's any updates that you think our listeners might need to know about. But all the best of luck with askcarol.ai when it does go live. And thanks for your time.
Thank you, Gareth. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. Hopefully you've had a great listen, and I've had plenty of wisdom and snippets there, because there's certainly things that I learned along the way. And so, really interesting conversation, some huge value pieces in there. So if you've enjoyed that, please share it with any other investors that you think might value from it. And we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We hope you have learned something and have some tips to take away. We'd be very grateful if you enjoyed the show. You could give us a review and share with anyone that you know that may be interested. And of course, subscribe to the show so you can get notified when a new episode is released. If you'd like us to answer any questions or go deeper on a specific topic, please drop us a message at primeproperty.finance. See you on the next episode.